Welcome to the Architecture Made Simple podcast, brought to you by Scrace Architects. In this series of podcasts, Tim and Andy explore different aspects of architecture, design and art.
Welcome to the first episode of the Architecture Made Simple podcast. Tim and I will be talking about his practice and hopefully learning a little bit about how we shape buildings and our environment. Somewhat pertinent to lockdown, we start by talking about how to frame a view. So Tim, framing a view, tell me what's that about?
Well, framing a view, Andy, is really about sort of capturing an element that is outside by using a frame in the form of a door, a window, an archway to capture an element that exists outside and connecting you with that space.
So that's a really important part of a design for you.
I think it's one element. I think that it plays quite a crucial role because we are kind of quite naturally connected to the outside, and I find it important in everything I do. Often clients come to me and they say, you know, I want that wow factor. I want to, and they've bought the house based on the view. So what do you want to do with it? Well, ultimately, the most important thing is framing it and capturing it in a way, whether that's a panoramic view or there's always going to be a corner or a junction somewhere.
So what techniques are there that you can use to frame a view?
In terms of sort of the techniques, I would say that the techniques can be about keeping the opening simple. Often you see in modern design an attempt to kind of take away all the frills, the ironmongery, the frame, reduction in the size of frame, so that you get the purity of the outside or even just the connection of some light. And I think that's where you can really maximise what you've got.
So you've mentioned lights a few times already. So light has to be a big consideration, especially when it comes to windows or doors which have panes of glass in them.
Yeah, well, it is how we wake up in the morning, and it's how we go to bed at night. We watch the sun. You know, our day plays out around the sun. I'm sure we'll cover that at some point or other. But in terms of how the light gets into your indoor space, it does largely through windows, right? So it's kind of is trying to maximise that by putting them in the right place. So you might have fewer windows on your north elevation and more on your south. But if you want a purer light, you might look to the north because that offers a different type of light.
So I guess from the north you'll get a more consistent light all day because the sun's never going to shine directly in that window. Yeah,
that's right, and that's what art galleries use to kind of get the purity of the space and to light up their masterpieces. So that's one means of employing the window in that way, and if you would look up, that what we would be looking up at would probably be the sky, which would be framed.
Some of the best rooms I've been in are the rooms that you walk into and you kind of discover the window as you enter the room. Is that an easy thing to achieve?
I think it's not quite as easy as people expect it to be. I think it's probably been planned out and thought about in quite a lot of different ways. Like we mentioned earlier about that maximising of that view or that point of arrival. You either arrive immediately in the view or you use architectural devices, and by devices I probably mean walls, that shape the space, that lead you and perhaps open out in display or otherwise to what would be a larger expanse and a bit more light, or something that's directed in terms of that view, so a point on the horizon that you're looking towards.
So in some ways you can build a story into a room sometimes I guess it's easier with a larger space, or am I wrong?
I think it is easier with a larger space. So, you go to a museum or you go to somewhere that wants to tell you a story about something, then they will capture those elements as you go along and they will bring you to the largest and most celebrated area. And that's sort of a process called a promenade. That's harder to capture in a house because you've got less space to kind of work with. But I think that you can achieve something similar within your own home. It means that you've just got to think about how doors and openings relate to one another before you arrive at that point. So if they line up, for example, that's obviously, there's sort of a connection then from the front to the back of the house, which is often an easy way of making your space feel bigger.
And I guess openings are largely about, or not largely, but can really add to the sense of space within a room. If you get them right.
Yeah, I think light, which is what we rely on for the openings, makes the space bigger, and considerably bigger. So there are recent studies that show that the light affects our well-being, and obviously that's becoming more and more well documented. But in terms of that opening, you could have a smaller opening, and you would still sort of get a feel for that, how big that space was, because you'd still have an element of light that was lighting it. It just might draw your focus to that point, so you could have a porthole or something a little bit smaller that would focus your attention on that view out, maybe almost like, not quite like a bird hide. A bird hide is more sort of panoramic, but say a porthole on this ship, you're drawn to that opening to look out the window.
Or probably more like a telescope, so you're kind of focusing someone's view on quite a small area rather than a panoramic window, which would allow you to look all across the horizon.
Yeah.
So maybe in some way you could be lucky and have something beautiful to focus, maybe a tree in the distance or a building that's quite attractive in the distance that you can focus someone's view on.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So let's get down to the nuts and bolts of, let's call them frames and structures within walls that give us openings. Obviously some that have none at all. An arch would have none apart from the plaster or brickwork finish, whereas a window would have, say, a metal or a wooden frame. How important is considering the finish?
I think it's a simple process for those that know what they're thinking about. I think for other people it's quite hard to deal with all of the options that you get when you go to a window manufacturer and say, I'd quite like a door, please. And I quite like a window, because you get different options on ironmongery, hinges, all different kinds of things, which bolts you want, all the rest of it. The thing is that for me, those elements all can detract from what you're fundamentally wanting from that window or that door or that opening, which is to frame what is outside. And that's why I think the more tactile you can be and the more considered you can be when you're choosing the materials and looking sensitively at that relationship between inside and outside, you can perhaps distill the very changing of the seasons by having that connection with your outside world. So you can watch the garden, you can watch the trees change, you can watch the rain and feel protected, as we all enjoy. And it is that bizarre, bizarrely we put roofs over our heads to shelter ourselves, but ultimately we want to have a connection. We're rushing to get bifold doors to get back outside, and that's the reason you've got one.
Yeah. Well, I think there's this romantic notion that we all have about a large window on some part of our house, so we can, like you say, feel protected, but still feel like we're connected with the outside.
That's right. I think we still think that we're going to enjoy a lovely British summer.
Well, we're optimistic every spring that summer's going to be, and we've done really well this year.
We've done quite
well
for
weather. Maybe not so much on other things.
Yeah.
So, can you talk me through a little bit nuts and bolts on your process when, let's say, if we're redesigning a space and the windows and doors aren't quite right? Where would you start when you're redesigning something that's already there?
I think I would look at the particular openings, and I would look to see whether they could be reduced inside or increased in size. So depending on what you wanted to do with that space, whether you wanted to make the big, everyone is drawn to open plan. You know, they just immediately go, right, I want a bigger space. I want to be, you know, and then you show them the size of that space when it's finished, and people go, I don't know what to do in it. Whereas there's a rationale to kind of think about individual spaces and think about how, almost rooms within that bigger space, and that can be achieved by sort of shaping how you use the envelope of the building. So you might have a smaller window where you might have a snug or a couch or somewhere, you know, somewhere to snuggle down at night, whereas you want a bigger opening because you're leading out to the garden and the barbie or whatever you got out on the deck through your bifold doors.
So when you say rooms within the larger space, that doesn't necessarily need to be partitioned by walls. That can just be through design. Through good design, you can have parts of a room that do different things and feel like a different room, but are actually part of one large space.
Yeah. You see a similar thing in bizarrely when you go to a department store, or you know, they guide you on with a footpath, and you know, you walk up the footpath. And so with bigger spaces, you need to think about the flooring, and you need to think about the furniture as your way of defining that space.
And I guess so two different types of window in the same room would do that. So if you have in one half of the room a large expansive window, and then you change the colours and tones on the walls, and you have a smaller window, and it just feels a little bit more cosy, that's enough sometimes.
Yeah, I think so, because you know, but the one thing people forget about the bigger, larger windows is that when you make you make the curry in the kitchen, and you've got to open the big window to let the air out.
And it takes a lot more cleaning.
It does take a bit more cleaning.
So I like the nitty gritty. So when you're considering the finish, is that important to obviously it's important to consider the inside, because you can see that's where you spend the most of the time looking at your windows when you're in your house, is from the inside. But I guess it's important from the outside too, to be in context with the building and the surrounding environment that the house is in, or the building's in.
Yeah, I think that relates really back to kind of how subtle the window's going to be, and often these days people are reverting to darker tones because they don't want the opening to stand out as an opening, because they can see that they want to look at the materiality of the build. So, you know, maybe the masonry or the timber cladding, or whatever reference that you've taken from the local natural environment to build your building in the first place.
And a local natural materials, do you think that's important?
Yeah, I try and abide by that as much as I can. It's harder these days, but it's got to be something that we consider when we think about the sustainability of bringing in bricks from China or from Holland, or importing other materials. If we've got the resource locally, then we should be using resources locally. I recently, looked at Michelmersh bricks because I was at a site near Michelmersh. It's easy if you got it on your doorstep. It's just that not everything's on our doorstep anymore. We can't necessarily dig out more, but we've got to be sustained about our approach to what we use, and in doing that, we connect more with the place that we're in. Because there is this inherent kind of relationship between the ground and what we're building.
And do you think clients are heading that way in their thinking as well, the sustainability?
I think...
Or they're more open to it, maybe?
I think people are more open to it. I think in terms of information, I think that a lot of people are focused on the things that have been pushed by government, so solar panels or... even geothermal heat pumps these days, but although I've tried to incorporate them in my designs, the geothermal is often too expensive. Solar's a lot more economic these days, but that's one element. That's not about the core carbon effect that you have in building something. if you want to do something sustainable, don't do any building.
Yes.
that's not an advertisement for an architect. But,
But it is though, because you can repurpose what you have, which is far more sustainable than building something new.
Yeah, it's about managing your intervention on the existing environment, and if you treat your house as part of that existing environment, then you're a good way to being sustainable in your design. And you could probably do a lot worse than doing that.
We started off this podcast mainly talking about framing a view. We've diverged a little bit, but that's fine. But I want to bring it back to framing a view and your interest in people's views, and you've set up a little competition.
Yeah, the competition's been running for months now. We've got 1 month left, and effectively we're asking everyone out there to reflect a little bit on the fact that they've been stuck inside. We've been encouraged to look out and reflect on our connection with the environment. And perhaps we're probably a bit more in tune than we have been in the past. So the idea is to add a bit of positivity to the end of lockdown, and encourage people to look to new horizons and frame their own view from their own home, office, or their shed, and send that in. So you can email me at info@sgracearchitects.co.uk.
Okay. And is there any restrictions on that? Does it need to be photography? Could it be art? Could it be...
No, really, it's just a picture. So despite all this highfalutin stuff, it is basically you can photograph it, you can sketch it, you can paint it. I would encourage you to be a bit different, and that way things will stand out. But yeah, share it on social media. You can find me at Tim's Grace. I'm sure Andy will share it as well.
All of the information will be you'll find it in the description of this podcast. We're going to record a few more of these, and the next one's going to be about in-between spaces. Can you just give me a 10-second?
Yeah, well, it's really we're talking about the insides quite a lot in terms of this framing of view. What happens is often the spaces in between different rooms or different buildings get forgotten, so streets or what have you, and really those are the spaces that connect us. And those are the spaces that are often the most interesting, because they result in things being juxtaposed next to each other. And so we'll be talking a little bit about what you can do with those, really.
So come back and join us again for the next podcast, where we talk about those interesting in-between spaces.